Okay, well, it really is a huge pleasure to be able to introduce to you today, on behalf of the University of Essex, our speaker for our second C.G. Jung lecture, Murray Stein. Murray, as I'm sure all of you here know, is a massive figure in the Jungian world. Having been an undergraduate at Yale and gained a PhD at the University of Chicago, he trained at the Jung Institute in Zurich. And he's been writing papers and books on Jungian topics since, well, at least since his paper on Hephaestus from 1973. Yes, that is more than 50 years ago. And many of these texts have become standard canonical works. He's also taken up responsible positions within the collective structures of the Jungian world. For example, he was president of the worldwide Jungian umbrella body, the IAAP. He's played a crucial part inside Jungian training organizations. He helped found the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts and the Chicago Society of Jungian Analysts, and then more recently he was president of the International School of Analytical Psychology, ISAPZURICH. And I have to say that without Murray's writings, our work here, teaching on our MA in Jungian and post-Jungian studies, would really be very, very difficult indeed, because there's hardly a module topic that doesn't have one of his texts on the reading list. And this is because, unusually, they managed to combine theoretical rigour and originality with elegance and readability. And that really is quite unusual. So, this week alone, for example, I taught a class on midlife, which, to be honest, focused almost entirely on Murray's classic book on midlife from 1983. And incidentally, yesterday I was listening to a video that the late David Henderson had put together on this topic. And David's recent death has left a huge hole in our department, but I smiled to hear him describe In Midlife quite rightly as a, quotes, truly fantastic book, which I urge you to read. He goes on, once you have read it, it will inevitably have an impact on your thinking. Very true. And exactly the same week, this week, my colleague Roderick Main taught a class to undergraduates that focused on Murray's Map of the Soul 7, Persona, Shadow and Ego in the World of BTS. So, that's yet another example, and that's just 1 week. But what really is unusual about Murray, I feel, is that despite this load-bearing importance for our field, theoretical, institutional, personal, and so on, he somehow manages to avoid making any of this about him. There's no cult of personality with Murray. In fact, I personally have always found him to be extraordinarily unassuming. There's no showing off in his books or papers, none when you meet him in person. In other words, he personifies what we might call the individuational attitude. And as a result, he remains genuinely open and hospitable to the new thought, the new idea, the new perspective. And, I really can't emphasize enough how refreshing, valuable, and indeed rare such a quality is when one finds it in a figure as significant as Murray. I can't help seeing this in terms of something he mentions in Midlife about how to keep alive the hermetic dimension when one has emerged from that particular crisis. And he describes it in this way. He says it's a receptiveness to the psyche's permanently liminal condition and to the continual presence of Hermes retained within a newly integrated attitude of consciousness. And I was moved when reading the same section of that book to find these comments on Hermes. He says, Koinos Hermes, the common Hermes, is a Hermes who is accessible and companionable, a God who brings fellowship into a human encounter and the quality of community into a group. And for me, this is exactly the unflashy but hugely important quality that Murray himself brings to our field. So long may he continue to do so. Okay, time to hand over to you, Murray.
Thank you, Mark. You're too kind. It's a bit embarrassing to hear all of that, but I take it with gratitude. Thank you.
Thought you might say that.
Let me just say a word about the topic I've chosen for this honor that you've given me to speak at the second annual Jung Lecture at Essex University. I follow Renos, who was the first last year, and I listened to Renos's talk last year, and not knowing that I would be sitting here, following him, a word that he used in his lecture stuck with me, and I wrote to him, and we had a bit of a conversation about it, and the word was metanoia. And it's a word that I'm going to use a lot in what follows now. This is going to be a lecture on what I call metanoetics. 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 It's a word I haven't come across in my reading, so it just came to me one day, and going back and forth with Renos on this subject of metanoia, it seemed to have just popped into the air between us, and we decided that it was something worth pursuing. So for the past year, I've been thinking quite a lot about metanoia, and so I want to discuss that with you tonight. And please put your questions up on chat as we go, and we'll have time at the end for discussion. I'm going to leave the better part of 30 minutes at the end for discussion. I want to hear your reactions to questions that I'm going to raise. I'm not going to try to give you a lot of answers about metanoia, but I'm going to try to raise questions and possibly outline a field of study. So let me share my screen and we will go from there. Metanoetics. So as I said, I came to this after listening to Renos's lecture and thinking for the past year, how does metanoia possibly fit in with what we understand to be the individuation process? And so I'm trying to weave together the concept of metanoia, the experience of metanoia, with what we can call individuation psychology, about which I've written quite a lot, not particularly emphasizing this feature of individuation, but were I to redo many of my essays this stage of my life, I would definitely insert it as a very important, indeed essential aspect of the individuation process. So let's start out with some understanding of the term. It's a Greek word, and it basically comes from the Greek word metanoia, made up of two parts: meta, meaning beyond or after, and nous, noeo, meaning perception or understanding or mind. Now you're familiar with this way of combining the word meta with other words to indicate a kind of elevated type of thinking. For instance, metaphysics. Metaphysics takes physics to another level, to a higher level of contemplation and thinking about why is it that the world exists at all, and why does it have the structures it has? It isn't so much the kind of scientific inquiry when you're looking at causes and effects and trying to figure out how pieces are put together and how they interact with each other. It steps back and it looks at physics or the physical world, the material world, from an elevated point of view or an abstract point of view. In psychology, we also have metapsychology. It's a word that Erich Neumann uses quite a bit to speak about psychology at a more theoretical level. So not so much about cases and examples, clinical work, but to think about psychology from a more theoretical point of view. I'm not going to take it in that direction, particularly with metanoia and metanoetics, but rather an inquiry into what does a higher mind mean, metanoia, a higher or beyond mind or understanding. What is that higher? What is that meta? What does that consist of? Now, Renos said he didn't have time for us to work on metanoetics together, but he did send me an interesting paragraph or so about Renos is Greek, and he understands the Greek language much better than I do, although I took a few years of it in college, but it's pretty basic. Renos wrote me and he said, overall, in Greek classical philosophy, Plato and company, and in particularly in Aristotle, nous, the word mind, refers to both intellectual understanding as well as intuitive thought. So intellectual and intuitive, that's nous. And Jung uses that word quite a bit, or refers to it, nous, the mind. The church fathers, Renos goes on, developed their understanding further along these lines by specifying very clearly that nous does not only refer to the intellectual side of human understanding, but also to the way the heart perceives overall. They understood nous as the unique set of human faculties that make a biological organism a human being, a unique person. That's nous. In modern Greek, he says the word metanoesis was introduced rather recently as the Greek translation of the English psychological term metacognition, which is a very interesting concept relating empathy with the understanding of one's own feelings in relation to the understanding of the feelings of others. Nous covers a very broad range of cognition, from thinking to feeling, from understanding in a more technical sense to understanding also with the heart. And we think of Pascal, the heart has its reasons, just as our cognition, our thinking function has its reason and its reasoning ability. So when we talk about metanoia, we're going to consider that it has something to do with noia, the heart and the mind, and taking that to another level, to a meta level. So I'm proposing the term metanoetics. As far as I know, it's an original term. I may be wrong, but I haven't found it anywhere else. And I want to call this the study of a type of radical transformation of the personality. It's a type of transformation. We can think of other types of transformation of the personality that happen, for instance, because of trauma or things that happen to us. Personalities change for various reasons. But metanoia as a type of radical transformation of the personality, of heart and mind. So in this lecture, I will describe some possible features for this field of metanoetics as it might be considered from the viewpoint of individuation, the individuation process. What is the psychology of metanoia? That's what we want to think about and question. So I'll attempt to hold up a mirror to this profound process of psychological and spiritual transformation by speaking of the metanoic moment, or what we could call the strike, the metanoic process, which has to do with integrating an experience, a numinous experience, and the consequences that we can speak of as the metanoic life. So 3 steps: the strike, integration, and consequences. This is just a graph of the individuation process that, Jung divided individuation basically into 2 parts, first half of life and the second half, and others have contributed, Erich Neumann in particular, and divided it further. So in the first half of life, you have childhood, followed by young adulthood and divided by adolescence. And then you have the midlife period, and then you have mature adulthood, and then late stage individuation, retirement, old age, and so on. So we could speak about a type of metanoia in relation to each of these stages, but mostly we're going to focus on midlife and after. With regard to childhood, you could say there is a kind of metanoia, a change of mind and heart, a dramatic transformation in the mind and heart of the infant when it comes out of the womb, looks around, and begins making attachments to the world. And it's lured into the world and into relationship by a good enough mother. And in the course of things, makes a transformation from a kind of original narcissism, self-enclosure, to object relations. That's a type of transformation of the heart and mind, very important one that has consequences for all of life. And then there are these transitional periods. The most discussed ones are adolescence, midlife, and then going into old age, preparing for death, that late stage. Also can be a crisis time or transitional time. And these transitions are characterized by what is called liminality. And liminality, the word, it's a Latin word, it means between, in the doorway, betwixt and between. You aren't in one room, you're not yet in the other one, you're in the threshold. So something is being put away and behind, and something new is going to arrive, but you're not there yet. So these are typically initiation times. In original human life, there would be an initiation around the age of 12 or 13 when the child is taken away from the mother and or the caregivers and initiated the girls into their maturity as young women, the boys into their maturity as young men. And this has been much studied by anthropologists, and I refer to these 3 stages of transition in my book In Midlife that Mark was referencing earlier. There's a separation, there's liminality, and then there's reentry. And it's in this liminality period that the transformations take place. So midlife is a classic one for the type of metanoia that I'm going to discuss in this talk. The transformations that occur at midlife set the stage for what Jung called the second half of life, creating an ego self-access, entering into a deeper contact with the unconscious, and making a connection with the deeper layers of the psyche and integrating them. And this is often kicked off, midlife is often kicked off by an event, a powerful experience. It could be the death of someone. It could be a change, a radical change that one makes in their own personal life, divorce or changing careers, setting a person off in a whole new direction. And we want to speak about metanoia, particularly with regard to that period, midlife and after. Now, if you think about examples, the one that always comes to mind if you use the word metanoia, at least within religious context, Christian context, is St. Paul. On the road to Damascus, he has a vision, and it completely changes his life. He hears a voice, the voice speaks to him, it happens to be the voice of Jesus Christ. This Paul's conversion is considered the classic case of metanoia, change of heart and mind. He's trained as a Jewish rabbi with the great Gamaliel, the greatest rabbi teacher of his time. And now suddenly he's confronted with a whole new vision, and he has to do something with that. So that change in Paul's life is often referenced as the classic case or example of metanoia. And then there's also St. Augustine. St. Augustine's, by the way, I don't think it's known exactly what Paul's age was when this happened, but I imagine he was around 40 years old. He was probably about a bit older than the age of Jesus when he died at 33. Jesus had his transformation or metanoia moment at the age of 30 when he was baptized and he heard the voice from the heavens. Paul had his metanoia experience probably in his early 40s, would be my guess. I haven't looked that up in the among the scholars, but that would be my guess as to his age. And then he lived well into the 90s, I think, or 70s or 80s, and died in Rome. Now, St. Augustine is another interesting case of metanoia. He had metanoia occurs at several times in life. It isn't just a one-time experience. And you have these moments when something happens and it just changes everything. And in Augustine's case, before he was a saint, he wasn't a saint until he died, but Augustine of Hippo was reading a book by Cicero. And reading that book changed his life. He decided he was going to study philosophy. So he became a great philosopher. He's a very bright fellow, sent to the best universities of the day. And from philosophy, he got into religion, religious studies, and then he had his moment of revelation. He was in a garden, and he was meditating. He was studying. His mother wanted him to become a Christian. She was putting a lot of pressure on him. He was studying with the bishop in Milan, famous man, Ambrose, and but he was struggling. And then all of a sudden, in a certain moment, he heard a voice. He heard the voice of a child, not a real child, a visionary child. And the child said, "Take up and read." So he opened his Bible at random and he read a passage from Romans 13, which is basically a call to reform your life, give up the past, give up what you've been doing, and set your course in a totally new direction. And from there, Augustine went on to write his great work, the Confessions. Now, the Confessions of St. Augustine are it's a book. It's his autobiography. It's one of the great stories of a life's transformation and the direction it took after the metanoia experience. And it's a book that itself can stimulate metanoia. It's a powerful, deep contemplation of the spiritual life. And I remember reading that book when I was roughly 50 years old, and it set me off on active imagination of all things. I'd learned about it as a student, but I hadn't done very much. And suddenly it hit me, that's the way to go. It was from reading actually the Confessions of St. Augustine. And what he puts you in touch with in that book is another dimension of reality beyond what we see with our senses. It's a meta reality. It's a spiritual reality. So when he wrote the City of God, he's talking about a different kind of life, a different kind of world based on spiritual principles and spiritual understandings. And this meta world is what he then wove into his worldly existence from having had that experience of metanoia. Here's what he writes in the Confessions. Belatedly I loved thee, O beauty so ancient and so new. Belatedly I love thee, for see, thou wast within, and I was without. And I sought thee not there. Unlovely, I rushed heedlessly among the lovely things that thou hast made. In other words, nature. He loved women, he loved beauty, he loved the good life. He was a hedonist. Thou wast with me, but I was not with thee. These things kept me from thee, even though they were not at all, unless they were in thee. Thou didst call and cry aloud and didst force open my deafness. That's when the little child called out to him. Thou didst gleam and shine and didst chase away my blindness. Thou didst become fragrant odors, and I drew in my breath, and now I pant for thee. I tasted, and now I hunger and thirst. Thou didst touch me, and I burned for thy peace. This is the testimony of metanoia. This is what happened to him. And now he has a totally different experience of God. He isn't about God, he knows God. So when the interviewer asked Jung, do you believe in God? And Jung famously said, no, I can't believe, I know. He was speaking like Augustine, I know. Now Jung is another case. Augustine was in his 30s when this happened to him. So it was a midlife transformation moment. Jung also was in his 30s when he had that important dream about the child, about the young girl, the dove that came to him. I'm just going to read a short passage from Memories, Dreams, Reflections, where he writes about this important moment just before he begins his journey deeply into the unconscious to eventually create the Red Book. He says, around Christmas 1912, I had a dream. In the dream, I found myself in a magnificent Italian loggia with pillars, a marble floor, and a marble balustrade. I was sitting on a gold Renaissance chair. In front of me was a table of rare beauty. It was made of green stone like emerald. There I sat looking out into the distance, for the loggia was set high up on the tower of a castle. My children were sitting at the table too. Suddenly, a white bird descended, a small seagull, this is the strike, or a dove. Gracefully, it came to rest on the table, and I signed to the children to be still so they wouldn't frighten it away. The pretty white bird, immediately, the dove was transformed into a little girl, about 8 years of age, with golden blonde hair. She ran off with the children, played with them among the colonnades of the castle. I remained lost in thought, musing about what I had just seen. The little girl returned and tenderly placed her arms around my neck. Then she suddenly vanished. The dove was back and spoke slowly in a human voice. Only in the first hours of the night can I transform myself into a human being, while the male dove is busy with the 12 dead. Then she flew off into the blue air, and I awoke. So this voice of the child again leads Jung to a year or so later, just about exactly a year later, to decide to follow the spirit of the deep instead of the spirit of our times, spirit of the depths, and calls out his window, "My soul, where are you?" He's calling for this dove, for this girl. "My soul, where did you go?" Well, she's with the dead. Eventually, the dead come to him. You get the 7 sermons to the dead, and you get an enormous transformation in Jung from the period of 1913 to 1928, when he was creating the Red Book and having these numinous experiences. Jung became Jung during that time. Before that, he was young Carl, a follower of Freud, a brilliant student, very successful as a psychiatrist, but he wasn't Jung. So as a result of his experience, Jung became Jung. That's a metanoia experience. Now, I want to think for a moment about what can trigger these types of turnings from normal noetics to metanoetics. Normal noetics, you're a good student, you're a scholar, you go to Essex University, you get your doctorate. That's all noetics, and you have a sense of the meaning and the depth of all those texts, but you haven't really experienced them. Takes time to experience them, and then midlife will descend upon you, or you will have something will trigger. And later you will go back and read those texts again. You'll say, "Oh my God, now I get it. That's what Plato was talking about." Or that's what Jung was talking about. Once you've had the experience, you read differently. You understand differently. That's a metanoic reading and understanding. So what can trigger this? What can get it going? Well, typically it's a vision like you see in Paul or Augustine. And I want to make the point, this isn't so uncommon. This isn't something that only the great sages have experienced. Everybody has these. I want you to think about your own life. When has your life gone through a metanoic experience? And these are some of the things that can trigger it. You might have a vision. Now, visions aren't so unusual. People don't talk about them because they're afraid they'll be hospitalized or given some antipsychotic medications, but they aren't so uncommon, actually. People have visions and might tell a few friends about it and then forget about it. But it would be good to do something with it. Or you might have a dream that triggers a metanoia movement. That is what we call a big dream. And I'll talk about one of those in a little bit. If you watch the film that was recommended, you saw the evidence of such a dream. These big dreams can change your life, your thinking and your feeling. That's metanoia, and include the spiritual dimension. Or you can have a trigger can be reading a book. As it was for me when I read Memories, Dreams, Reflections the first time, I was triggered. I never turned back. And what fascinated me so much about it was that Jung talked so much about dreams. I was 24, 25 years old at the time and had a good education, but nobody ever talked about dreams. And suddenly I thought, well, there's a whole dimension of life that's been missing. I started recording my dreams and was amazed at what I found there. And that took me to Zurich to study to become a Jungian analyst. So, or it can be a synchronicity, a chance occurrence that delivers meaning. That's synchronicity. It's a chance occurrence that delivers meaning. You don't have to make up meaning. It's there. You have to discover it in a chance meeting of a person or a chance event like Jung references with the scarab beetle in his office, famous example of synchronicity. And he said that changed his patient's attitude completely. And she rediscovered her religious heritage. It led her to her spiritual life. So a synchronicity can be a trigger or a breakdown. Some people have told me in my practice as an analyst, I've heard a lot of stories, that at a certain point in their life, something happens and they have a major breakdown and they have a couple of lost years, as they call them, where they're wandering, they're in liminality, they try various types of treatment, nothing works very well. But out of that comes something that they would have never discovered without the breakdown. Something from the depths emerges. And it may be a vision, it may be a dream, maybe a synchronicity, but the breakdown itself was an important part of it, of the turning, of the metanoia. And then these days, entheogens, these are psychedelics, are much discussed as triggers for a experience that could be metanoic. In other words, in the literature, Timothy Leary and so on writes about the experiences with LSD that opened up the windows to the other world, to an eternal world, to a world that one can't experience with one's ordinary mind, with one's noia, nous. But it's a meta-nous. It's a higher type of vision of the invisible world. And then that can lead to an important metanoic development, the integration process. Now, how do you integrate the experience, that elevated experience? You have the trigger, now living the metanoia. And people do it in various different ways. They might engage in a new kind of social engagement, in networks, in social action, doing things they wouldn't have considered relevant before or of interest to them. But because their heart has changed, or their mind has changed, their attitude has changed, they suddenly begin engaging in certain social action endeavors that are in line with the new way of thinking and feeling. So it's a kind of extroverted, action-oriented way of living the metanoia. And then there are people who write and communicate. They give lectures about their experience. They tell others, whether in writing or other forms, kind of communication. They write poems, maybe. And then some people go into religious life as a result of their metanoic triggering experience. You think of Thomas Merton. He had a metanoia experience when he was in his 20s, and he went off and became a Trappist monk. Another figure that I am rather fond of, if you can see this book, this is the life story of a Chinese who then became Taiwanese monk, a Buddhist monk named Sheng Yen, called Footprints in the Snow. And it's a wonderful story of his change of life. He was in the army. He was in the Chinese army that came to Taiwan when the communists took over mainland China. And while in the army, he had an experience that led him to deep meditation. And he left the army and he went off into a retreat for 2 or 3 years, learned all about Buddhism and trained himself in meditation. Then he went to Japan and he did further training in Zen Buddhism and eventually became a leader in the Buddhist movement in the United States and set up some meditation centers in Brooklyn, New York, other places in the United States, became rather well known. So this can lead to, if it's available, modes of religious life. It did also for St. Augustine. St. Augustine, before he was converted, at one point he was praying and trying to figure out what he wanted to do. And he said, grant me continence and temperance, but not yet. He wasn't quite ready yet. But then he was, and he went and became religious. And living the metanoia also in everyday attitudes and behaviors, it just changes your relation to the world, your feeling about other people. And Jung once said, it's as if you're standing on a mountaintop, the Swiss Alps, standing on the mountain, and you're looking down into the valley, and you see a storm in the valley. You're on the mountain above the storm, but you see a storm in the valley. And you're both in the storm and you're above the storm. That was his description of living this metanoic life. You're above it, meta, but you're also in it. You're participating in it, but in a different way. And then also living the metanoia life, renewal practices. Now, those are very important to keep it fresh, to keep it alive, to keep the spiritual experience of the triggering moment active in your psyche. And so people will do various things like consistently meditate. Meditation is one way of keeping the spiritual life alive. Meditation or prayer, or just taking some time out during the day to renew that elevated view of things. So as we live in our lives and in our bodies, we live in a very temporal world, and we have to take care of everything that confronts us. We have to pay our taxes. We have to get our cars fixed. We have to take care of our children, pay our bills and all that. That's life in the temporal world, and we're responsible for all that. Metanoia doesn't change that, but it might give you a different attitude, a freer attitude toward it. And you can both do all of that in the temporal world and live in this quasi non-temporal world or eternal world at the same time. And that's what Jung was talking about with that metaphor of on the mountain and in the valley at the same time. Now, those of you who watched this video, I just want to say a few words about it. It's called Map of the Soul, the Self. It's a video of a discussion of a numinous dream that Diane Stanley brought to me, and it's a story of what she did with it. And I'm not going to repeat what was said in the film, but I just want to point out a few features. So if you haven't seen it, you can go and take a look. She brought me a dream, and we discussed it a lot, and then we decided to do something with it further, and eventually made this film in my office. But her dream was, I'm walking up the stairs of my house and have arrived at the 4th floor, the top of my house where I keep my art studio, when I notice another flight of stairs continuing upwards. I'm curious to decide to see where it leads. On top of the staircase, there is a door, which I open, and inside there's a large empty room with a fire burning in the center. That's the picture you see on your screen. I'm alarmed. A fire, it could burn down the whole house. So I go over to examine it. There's no fuel at all, nothing. My mind stops, time stops. I feel the presence of someone behind me and turn around to see, quotes, the teacher by the doorway. I go over and stand by him, and we look at the fire together. This is when I notice rays of light filling the room. The teacher says, "This is genuine. Keep the door open. People will be coming to see this." So with that, those words of the teacher in mind, we open the door to all of you so you can see the fire for yourselves. Some people have even, used this image in their meditations. You can go and sit in this room, look at the fire. It's an eternal fire. It never goes out. So it's supernatural. It belongs to the meta world. This 5th floor is the meta universe up there, but it is part of the house, which is the interesting thing. Now, when she started working with that, she here you see a picture of the 5 stories of the house. First story is a kitchen area. Second story is a living area. Third story is a bedroom area. Fourth story is a workroom area. And then the 5th story with the fire, the eternal flame. And we did a lot of associations with the eternal flame, Moses at the burning bush, and so on. It's a symbol of the self. It's a symbol of God, the divine, the eternal, that lives with us all the time. Now that 5th floor has always been there. She just discovered it now. So what do you do with it? So it's up there at the top. Well, what she does with it is very interesting. She's an artist and she started working with it. Now, here you see the same picture, but it's the floors are rearranged and they start at the bottom and go in counterclockwise and a clockwise direction around. Or is it counterclockwise? I can't quite see. But definitely in the center, she's placed the flame. So now the flame isn't above, isn't on the 5th floor. It's actually in the center of the house, and everything revolves around it. And that's what one can do with a metanoia experience. Instead of just sort of leaving it where it is and thinking about it every once in a while, actually putting it to work, putting it in the center of the house, in the center of your life. And that would be a true metanoia, doing something like that with it. Now, here's another picture she made. Again, around the center, here you see the Bindu point at the center. She's a Buddhist practitioner, so she knows all about the Bindu point and the mandala. And there you see the flame, the center, the mandala, and again, working with the flame, working with the eternal fire. And here you see a picture of the flame radiating out from a contained space. That's her temporal life. And in the center is the fire, and it radiates outward. And that's very important to this metanoia changes the heart. So the heart, instead of withholding, radiates. The heart, instead of wanting to be seen and praised and loved, it does the reverse. It radiates, it loves, it puts out the energy that it has received from the experience. And that's what you see in all the cases of the metanoia, Paul being the great classic example of it, but also Jung. Jung had a tremendous visionary experience in 1944 when he was 69 years old, had a heart attack, and in the hospital he had these visions of the sacred marriage and moving into outer space and going into the afterlife and all of that. And he writes about that as this is the most tremendous experience he ever had in his life. And he says it was not imagination, it was absolutely real. He uses those words, not imagine. Now, he gives very high value to imagination, as you know. But this was not imagination. In other words, it doesn't belong to noia, to nous, to ordinary functioning. It comes from somewhere else. It comes from this supratemporal world. And it's absolutely real, he said. Now, that's 1944. Think of what he did after that. Think of all that he wrote. His best work comes while he's, not so well in his life, last 15, 16 years. But he writes Ion, he writes Answer to Job, he writes Mysterium Conjunctionis, he writes the essay on synchronicity and a bunch of other essays. It's an amazing output from that post-metanoia, late metanoia experience. And I want to repeat, metanoias can happen more than once in life. There can be a series of them, and each one changes. And here you see another picture that Diane painted. This couple looking, and everything is connected out there. They're standing on solid earth, on the ground, but they're looking into the supernatural world. We call it supernatural because it's meta, like metaphysics. It exists. And if you're a metaphysician, you you know that it's real and that it's important. Jung tended to dismiss metaphysics because it's so not psychological enough for him. But then he would turn around and translate metaphysics into psychology. So he just did a little trick. He thought about it in a slightly different way, and then he could accept it. Jung was a great assimilator. He didn't let anything assimilate him, he assimilated it. So when he studies the Tibetan Book of the Dead, for instance, he assimilates it to his way of thinking, to psychology. So what he thinks he's doing there is updating these ancient doctrines and experiences, bringing them into modern times where modern people can understand psychology. They can't do very much with metaphysics. But it isn't as though he left behind the metaphysical world altogether. He just converted it into psychology. That's my take on it at any rate. There's just one more thing I want to say before I stop and we can have some discussion time, and that is to think about metanoia and analysis. Can metanoia find a home in the analytic frame? We spend a lot of time in Jungian psychoanalysis, at least, working with the unconscious and working with dreams. And sometimes we get a big dream, but often I have the feeling people don't know what to do with a big dream, except admire it and make a note of it. But work with it and do something with it, that's another matter. I'm going to quote a very short passage from Jung's essay on rebirth, where he talks about the legend of Kidder, the verdant one in the 18th surah of the Quran. It's a wonderful essay that he wrote in, I think it was 1939 at Renos. He gave it a spontaneous lecture at Renos, taking off from what one of the scholars of Islamic mysticism had said. And he goes into his interpretation of the 18th surah of the Quran, and then he writes it up later. It's called On Rebirth, and it's in, I think, volume. I'm not sure where in the collected works it is, but maybe volume 9, 1, or 11. He writes, the legend in the legend, in the surah, it says that these wise people went into a cave for many years. They went into a cave. So he says the legend has the following meaning. Anyone who gets into that cave, that is to say, into the cave, which everyone has in himself, or into the darkness that lies behind consciousness, will find himself involved in an at first unconscious process of transformation. By penetrating into the unconscious, he makes a connection with his unconscious contents. This may result in a momentous change of personality. Now, that, of course, is his experience. Early on in the Red Book, he writes about an experience that he had, an active imagination, going into a cave. It's one of his first experiences, maybe the first, in his confrontation with the unconscious. He goes into a cave, and there he finds a stone with a cover. He takes the cover off, he looks down, he sees a dark stream flowing, a dead body in the stream, a severed head, horrible blood comes rushing out of the opening, and he's horrified. This was his introduction to the unconscious. So he says anyone who goes into the cave is bound to find something there, something deep that will confront him. Well, first thing that confronts one typically is the shadow. It can be a very frightening experience, a very off-putting experience. But if one keeps on going, goes deeper and works with the material, then a transformation should come about. This may result in a momentous change of personality. What is that change of personality? That's what we're calling metanoia. It's an attitude that takes into account the unconscious. It's not just based on nous, unconscious mind. It's based on the conscious mind plus what is experienced in the irrational side of the mind, in the unconscious. And this combination, when worked with, creates the metanoia experience and the aftermath of the metanoia experience, the metanoic life. Now I ask you, isn't that what we do in analysis? When somebody comes to you for analysis, depending on who it is, of course, you don't do this with every customer that comes along. And in fact, you have to be quite careful about going into the cave or inviting them to go into their cave. But when you do, it's what we call depth psychology, a depth psychoanalysis. It means working with the unconscious. And what that brings about is an experience of what has been lost, what has been forgotten, what has been repressed, all of that material in the basement. Diane Stanley also speaks about that in the film, unpacking what's in the basement and bringing it into consciousness and giving it new life. And connecting all of that material to what one knows in one's conscious world about oneself. That totality is who you are, is what you are. What you are isn't just your conscious nous, your conscious ego awareness, centered in your history and your rational life and your cultural complexes and all of that. There's much more. And if you keep going into the unconscious, like Jung did, and people who stay with analysis for a long time, working with important dreams, taking them further in active imagination, developing their experience of the unconscious in this way within the context of analysis, with an analyst to speak with about what's going on in the inner world, and then taking it into life, doing something with it, creating a monument, creating a structure. Jung built Bollingen after his experience of the unconscious. And it took him, I think, 12 years to complete the first 4 parts. And then much later in life, he put on a 5th part, a tower. And he said, this represents the self. This represents the self for me. And when I go to Bollingen, I can feel myself most completely at home with myself, in myself. I am at one with myself. At Bollingen, he felt at one with the self, we could say, more than his consciousness, but with all of his intuitions, all of his memories and images of the super natural world, the metapsychological world, or what we call the metanoic world, always with him when he's sitting out there at Bollingen, meditating, looking out across the lake. The end of his life, he told Mary Louise von Franz a dream. And he said, I dreamed last night that the Bollingen, the other Bollingen on the other side of the lake, that's been under construction for a number of years, I've had many dreams about it, is now complete. So I know I will die soon. So that's where he moved after his death on June 6, 1961. Next year in Zurich, we will celebrate Jung's 150th birthday. It will be a grand celebration. I hope many of you come. It's an IAP Congress in August, and we will celebrate Jung's life and his great contributions to our time, which in part, at least, is this lifting up of what is a metanoic life. So maybe at Essex, you could establish a department in metanoetics. I would be so honored. Okay, we can take some questions now. Mark, do you want to take a look at the questions in chat and read them off as you see
Yeah,
approach.
we first of all say thank you very, very much for such a beautiful and a rich talk. There's a lot to take in there, and so thank you very much. Yes, so how are we going to do this? I don't think there's much in the chat at the moment, so could people who want to ask a question maybe put their hands up if people know how to do that? I'd like to let me just ask a question before Bruce comes in. I was interested by what you were saying about the kind of late metanoia that Jung experienced when he had the heart attack and had dreams and visions around that, and how productive that final period was. Do you feel that in terms of what he wrote in that period, do you feel that there is a genuine kind of shift there, that he is moving into developing something new there that actually hadn't been there before, that comes out of that metanoia?
I've seen people argue that case. It isn't so obvious, but I think if you read those late texts deeply, of course, they're based on the alchemical studies that he'd been doing for 15 years before that. They're based on his experiences in the Red Book period. So you can trace a lot of history and make connections. But I think, to my feeling, the spirit is a bit different.
Mm.
And people have noticed that, or they've made that argument that it's deeper, that it's more somehow connected to the answer to Job, for instance, which was one of his favorite texts, a very controversial text, but very, very passionate, very heartfelt. Usually he doesn't write with much feeling. It's kind of distant, academic. He wants to be a scholar, he wants to be a scientist. But if you dig below that surface a bit, you get the feeling of deeper levels. But Answer to Job really was an outright expression of his passionate engagement with the Bible, biblical God, and God image, and his own religious tradition, and looking to the future. So I think that probably, whether it's a direct result, a causal effect from those visions, it's hard to say, but I think they really did affect him deeply.
Mm.
He said he had a hard time coming back into this world, back into the box,
Mm.
once he had been to that other realm. So I think, he had a lot of experiences of a similar nature in his life, but this was an extraordinary one, I think, kind of surpassed the earlier ones. But
Yes.
late stage experiences of this kind, I think of Dante. I've studied Dante a bit in these last years, and his lightning bolt hit him when he was quite old, I think a year or two before he died. Comes in the last canto of the Divine Comedy, where he's looking out he's by himself, he sees the Trinity, has this tremendous vision of the Godhead. But then he says it was as though he was hit by a bolt of lightning, and he could feel that energy coming into him. The love, he says, that moves the sun and all the other stars. He felt it, it came into him. And that, I think, was his ultimate metanoia experience. Um, I want to put the emphasis on experience. These aren't thoughts. These are, the lightning bolt hits you and it affects you. So his was very late in his life. He didn't live to a grand old age, but came toward the end of his life. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, obviously, you yourself have put a great emphasis, and the Jungian tradition generally puts a huge emphasis on midlife. But I think there's something to be said about those late changes, those late shifts, those late metanoias, because they have a slightly different quality to them, I think.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yes, Bruce, what's your question?
Um, it dovetails with what you were asking about, Mark. I was a student of Lee Roloff's many years ago, and late in his life, he became very interested in what he called the final interlude. He and Russ Lockhart. And his feeling was that as people are living longer into their 80s and 90s and even over 100, there were new sort of life challenges and life experiences. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about metanoia in the last stages of life, and particularly as we see a growing population of people who are going through cognitive decline. What does metanoia mean? Does it have possibilities for people who are entering stages of dementia or Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, things like that?
That's a very interesting question. I knew Lee Roloff very well, and I knew he was working on that book with Russ Lockhart. I don't know, was that published, by the way, Bruce? It was, yeah.
Yes, you can get it on Amazon.
Okay, I'll do that. Lee did a lot of work with active imagination using the sand tray. I know when he lived in Evanston, he had a wonderful sand tray room, and he would begin his practice every morning by taking an hour for himself and doing a sand tray. He said it would tell him, kind of set the day for him. It would tell him where is his psyche today. So it was very, very much in contact with the unconscious and with the psyche. And in his later years, after he moved to Seattle, I think he became very engaged in that project with Russ Lockhart. Dementia, to my knowledge, they didn't have any dementia. But I don't know. My mother, before she died, had some dementia. It wasn't severe, but one of my last conversations with her was probably within the last 6 months of her life. I asked her, "Do you have any dreams?" Now, she was a woman who was oriented by mathematics on the one hand and the Bible on the other, didn't have much time for mystical stuff, but was very deeply influenced by biblical beliefs and so on. But she said to me, "Oh, yes, I have very important dreams." And I said, "Well, what are they?" And she smiled at me and she said, "I can't remember, but they're very important." So from that, I gathered that something was going on that she couldn't really verbalize. She didn't have the competence because of the dementia on the one hand, but also hadn't had the vocabulary for that earlier, had never been in analysis or studied psychology. One of the great things that psychology gives us, Jungian psychology in particular, I think, is a way of speaking about these experiences, speaking about dreams in a way that can show their significance, can articulate their meaning without these concepts that Jung basically created for himself, largely using, of course, ideas from the past, but he really was an innovator of theory. He could put words on experience that we can use to put words on similar experience. And people would ask him about, well, does that word really refer to truth? He said, well, it's a word and it refers to something. But the word synchronicity, for instance, it's a wonderful word that captures an experience, an extraordinary experience that you would otherwise say, well, it's a coincidence, interesting coincidence. But it captures it in a way that gives it significance, and you dwell on it and you go deeper into it. And sometimes those experiences change your life, So the words that we have inherited and that you all learn at Essex University, have to take exams on. They're just a bunch of words. You have to define them. Andrew Samuels wrote a wonderful dictionary of Jungian psychology terms, and we memorize those to take the exams. But those words are extremely helpful in probing deeply into experiences that are mysterious, strange, outliers, Hermes experiences. Hermes is an outlier. He's at the margins. He brings messages from the other side. How do you capture those? Well, these terms and concepts are very helpful. My mother didn't have those. And in dementia, you lose a lot of your vocabulary typically, and you enter into a very strange, timeless world. I watched two old men, demented men in a nursing home not long ago, staring at the clock. And they just sat there and stared at the clock. I don't think they knew what time it was. I don't think they knew whether or not they'd had lunch an hour before or not. They were somewhere staring at the clock. Is that the world clock they're staring at? Wolfgang Pauli's famous world clock. Are they meditating on time and eternity? You just don't know. Where are they? Where has that mind gone? So I wouldn't write them off. I would pay attention. Sometimes maybe they can speak more coherently about their experiences, and they might surprise us. So I would leave it open as an open question.
Thank you very much.
Roderick.
Thank you so much, Murray, for that superb talk, which was everything Mark led us to expect it might be, and more, meta. I've got a sort of quick comment and then a question. The comment is that sort of dodgy scholar that I am, I Googled the word metanoetics and came up with, apparently the word has been used before as the translation of a book by the Japanese philosopher Hajime Tanabe, who wrote about something called Zangedo, which is literally the path of repentance, if you translate it literally from Japanese. But it was translated by James Heisig and some others as the philosophy of metanoetics.
Really?
In 1987, I think it was. Yeah. So there is a Jungian connection and tradition to the term even earlier.
I thought repentance is very important. And if you study people who've gone through tremendous changes, repentance, seeing your shadow, actually confronting your shadow and feeling that depth of repentance often has this effect. It's a trigger. I didn't mention that, but it's in quite a few of the stories of people whose lives change as a result of repentance. It can be a very deep experience and a change experience.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that maybe leads to my question, which is, I mean, the focus on these sort of big sort of moments, adolescence, midlife, retirement, these sort of periods where these big events happen. But I suppose in the case of each of the people that you mentioned, there was also a sort of, I mean, those are the big liminal moments, but there's also a sort of a permanent liminality that those people enter into, and that people involved in Jungian psychology, for example, enter into, that attending to the unconscious, where you're sort of in small ways on the sort of daily basis, very small ways, but you're remaining open to that uncertainty, that unknownness, and it's sort of incrementally building up. And then at certain points, it has these really huge transformative moments. But what do you think the relationship is between that sort of incremental build-up of attention to the unknown and then these big transformative moments?
I think if and this, this is why it would be an interesting field, because I think that should be studied. Probably all these big moments do have a buildup to them, that isn't very much noticed. Jung tended to notice those things. He noticed his dreams and the kind of if you read chapter 6 in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, you can see what the background was before he took the big step of following the spirit of the depths and so on. But probably the buildup is significant. What is the buildup? It's a kind of tension, I think. We speak of a tension between conscious and unconscious that sometimes results in enantiodromia, flipping into the opposite. But I think there's a kind of tension that builds up before a significant metanoic experience kind of gets triggered or explodes. You could certainly see that in Augustine's experience. There was a long preparation before that child spoke. Read the book. I've recently been reading The Brothers Karamazov. When did you last read that, Roderick?
Many years ago.
Do it again. Do it now. I read it many years ago too, and I picked it up recently, and I'm deep into it. It's full of amazing experiences, well, I won't go into that. You can read it, but the Father Zosima is his metanoic experience comes when he's a young man. He's in the military, and he's in love with a woman, and the woman marries another guy, and he gets very angry about that and jealous and envious of the other guy. So he challenges the guy to a duel. He wants to kill him. So they arrange for a duel. It's going to take place the next morning. He goes home, and then he starts remembering his brother who died at a young age and what his brother told him in his last days about the beautiful fields and God's creation. And he starts thinking about that. And he has a total breakdown. And he realizes what a terrible thing he's doing. He's going to kill this man? For what? This is crazy. He sees it. So he sees it and he repents. But he goes the next day to the duel. He can't back down. He's a soldier. It would be dishonorable. His fellow soldiers would never speak to him again. So he goes to the duel and he tells the other guy, you shoot first. The other guy shoots, hits him, wounds him a little bit. And then he takes his gun and shoots it straight in the air. And he bows in front of the other man and asks for his forgiveness. After that, he leaves the army and he becomes a monk. It's a total transformation in that moment of realization. What are you doing? This is crazy. What did some of our politicians at moments like that? Yes, that's metanoia. But Dostoevsky's a genius at describing these states of mind, transformations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Murray. I think we'll take one more question. There are some questions that have come up in the chat, but let's Anne, would you like to ask your question first?
Oh, thank you. I suppose my question is really just related to the how you may view how a psychotic experience might be related to metanoia, or what your understanding of that may be. And I suppose I'm thinking of recovery from, say, a psychotic experience, and how often it's so poorly held, within the medical framework. It's obviously diagnosed and medicated and so on. And I say it partly because I'm now 59, but I had a psychotic break in my 20s, my mid-20s. And I had an analysis, a Freudian analysis, of which I was very grateful because it was rational and it didn't frighten me, and it brought me back to grounding. And I think for me, the spiritual journey of it was so important because, and ironically, interestingly, it came when my father had early onset Alzheimer's, and I think it was quite linked to him going into Alzheimer's. But when I sort of felt like, for want of a better word, I felt quite cured, I was in a prayer group, and one of the priests spoke about a vision that he had when he did the Eucharist, the consecration of the host, Catholic prayer group. And he had a vision of Christ on Calvary and this kind of stuff. And it was just like I got baptized in a total relief of, like, suddenly everything I had experienced wasn't sort of madness. It was endorsed as a gift in a sense. And I'm very aware of the experience that I've had has gifted me in ways that, say, sometimes when I work with clients who, particularly when they're on the threshold of death and dying, I can sort of reach in there. And I know it's linked to having had that experience. So I don't know what I'm saying, but it's just something around, like, how can we kind of out this stuff a little bit more, to help people perhaps who something might have been medicalized that wasn't necessarily a problem in a funny sort of way. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yes, sure. I'm trying to think of the name of a well-known Jungian analyst in San Francisco, slipped my mind, John something, who ran a clinic. This was back in the 60s, 50s and 60s, I think, for first-time psychotic or, people with a psychotic break, first time, and treated them without medication and treated it as a transformation process. So he wrote a book about the imagery that would come forward while these patients were going through their, quotes, madness, and how that how that could be understood as a reorganization of the psyche. In other words, as a metanoia experience,
Yeah,
a breakthrough, and at the end of which they would be weller than well, as he said.
yeah,
So I think there are those kinds of psychotic. Psychotic is a bad word, but extreme experiences where it feels like the mind is out of control, and it's very frightening. And but something is breaking through that can be integrated later, can be used. It can be looked back upon, as you do, as a very valuable experience that has shaped your life, probably given you some sensitivity to religious material and feelings, and helps you to understand your clients better. So, yeah, I think we, the whole business of diagnosing it's a convenience, but it isn't an answer to anything. It simply is pointing out certain features of the personality at a particular moment in time that we can work with. And sometimes they can have a very positive outcome.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I don't know if I found it really helpful. I read some work by Paul Levy, who's a Jungian, but he's not trained, and he had a breakdown, quite very severe breakdown, but he sort of recovered himself, and he couldn't afford the trainings and so on. So he sort of taught himself, if you like. But it was the gift of it for me was that he was able to write without the constraints of the kind of formulations of the different schools. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly. Yeah. Just
Yeah.
freely about the experience. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Murray. We've got literally a minute left, so unfortunately, I'm not going to have time to go into the. There's a set of quite interesting questions, bringing up, asking about whether and to what extent this connects, for example, with the Stanislav Grof's conception of spiritual emergence and spiritual emergency. What's the relationship of metanoia with the encounter with the numinosum? These are all good.
Answer is yes. Yes.
All okay, that's good. Yeah, I think we're going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid. John Weir Perry, of course, was
John Weir Perry, exactly. Yeah.
And apparently Vicky Jo says the work is being carried on by Michael Cornwall, who can be found online. That's interesting. I didn't.
Good.
Okay, I think we'll have to wind it up there. But before I do, I want to mention something which I should have mentioned earlier, which is that Murray has a couple of books out recently, one of which is called The Mystery of Transformation, and another one of which is volume 8, no less, of his collected writings entitled Psychology and Spirituality. And Murray, I assume they're both published by Chiron Press.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
You can find them there. Okay, well, yeah, what can I say? I mean, thank you so much for a wonderful, wonderful evening. Wouldn't it be great if whoever we find to do the next C.G. Jung lecture could find something in your talk and then sort of carry it through into you know, and expand on that in a new way, so we get a kind of almost sort of Jungian relay race or something, or perhaps
I'll be.
yeah, a golden chain, perhaps we should call it. But anyway, yeah, something of that sort would be really wonderful. So I think I can speak on everyone's behalf to say that this was a really marvelous experience, and we all thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you for the opportunity, Mark.
Okay, so I think we'll have to end it there. So thank you everybody for attending, and yeah, see you next year at the next C.G. Jung lecture.